Okay, so welcome to solving quadratics. The first thing we need to go over is something called the zero product property. Okay, so it's a pretty simple concept. It basically says if two things multiply together, in this case we'll call them A and B, equal zero, then either A has to be equal to zero or B has to be equal to zero, or they both could be zero. Okay, but one of them has to be zero in order for the answer to be zero. Okay, so that means you could have A equals 7 and B equals 0. You could have A equals 0, B equals 3. But either way, when you multiply them, you'll get 0. Okay, so pretty simple concept, right? If we multiply two things and we know the answer is 0, then one of the two things has to be 0. Okay, so let's just take a real simple example, right? And we'll say, okay, I'm looking for two numbers. One is x and one is x plus 1. And I know when I multiply those two things, the answer is 0. So that means this could be 0. And it also means, all right, and then it wouldn't matter because over here I'd have 0 plus 1, which is 1, but 1 times 0 is 0. So we know that if x equals 0, I would have 0 times 0 plus 1, 0 times 0 plus 1, which I know is 1, which I know equals 0. So that checks, right? The other scenario we could have in that case is we could have this equal to 0. X plus 1 could be equal to 0. So that means that there's some value I could put in here for x that when I add it to 1 equals 0, which would make this term right here 0, which when multiplied anything by here would be 0. So we have a little equation to solve. So sometimes we have nothing to solve, and sometimes we have a little equation here. So we just subtract 1 from both sides, and we have x equals -1. So if I asked you, what are my two answers? What are my two possible numbers that x could equal that would make this a true statement? One scenario would be, we'll call it scenario 1, would be x equals 0, and scenario 2 would be x equals -1. So my answers are going to be 0 and -1. Those are my two possible values for x, and that would be the answer to my problem. Okay, so when we have a quadratic, all right, we end up with, when we factor quadratics, we end up with either something like we had up here. Okay, it might look like that, but more commonly we have two pieces here. We have maybe like an x minus 3 and an x plus 2. Now, if I set that equal to 0, there's a number that I could put in here that would make this 0. That would be like my a. Okay, and there's a number I could put in for this x that would make this 0. So either of those numbers would make each set 0, and that would be a solution to my problem. Okay, so in this case, we just set this equal to 0 and solve it. And we set this one equal to 0 and we solve it. So we add 3 to both sides. And we get x equals 3. So there's one answer. We subtract 2. And there's my other answer. Okay, and they get a little trickier than that. We're going to do some harder problems, but that's the basic gist of solving a quadratic. Okay, we factor it. All right, we get our factored answer. We know that either this one here in yellow has to be equal to 0, which would mean 0 times whatever is over here would be 0, and that would be one of my answers. So how do I find that? I just set the x minus 3 equal to 0 and solve that equation. Or x plus 2 could be equal to 0. So what value will I put in here? Set it equal to 0 and solve that. Okay, and those are your two answers. So you're always going to have two answers when you're talking about a quadratic. Now, let's talk about why that is. Okay, so I am going to, hold on a sec, give myself a little bit more room down here. Let's talk very briefly about what a quadratic is. Okay, so a quadratic is a representation. Well, it's a type of function, but what these are that we're factoring are equations of graphs, essentially. Okay, so if I have a graph, we have a type of graph called a parabola. Now, you're not going to be quizzed on this, you're not going to be tested on this, but I do want you to understand why we're doing this, okay? And a parabola is a graphical representation of a quadratic. A quadratic is an expression, right, where the highest power of a variable is squared. So there's going to be an x squared in it, and maybe there's a 5x, and maybe there's a plus 6. Okay, so if I were going to factor this like we did last unit, we would say what times what equals 6, that when I add equals 5, you would tell me 3 and 2, and you know the answer would be x plus 3, x plus 2. Now, there's a graph of this quadratic, okay, and I would tell you that the graph, if that's -1, and that's -2, and that's -3, okay, the graph of this quadratic looks something like that. That's a horrible parabola, and I'm terrible at drawing freehand like this, but the graph would look something like that, okay? And the solution to that graph, okay, now remember, you don't have to know this. We're not going to quiz you on this, but I want you to know that where that graph crosses the x-axis is my solution. And those points become important in math later on, okay? But we want to know what those 2 points are. These right here are my solutions. And what is represented at these points, or what is always going to happen at those points, is the y value in my equation is always going to be equal to 0. Okay, so this point right here is -3, 0, and this point right here is -2, 0. Okay, now the reason I knew I could draw it like that is if we go back to my original equation over here, and we have x plus 3 times x plus 2, and we set that equal to 0. So instead of it being equal to y and graphing it, we set it equal to 0. I want to know, when does y equal 0? That's going to tell me these 2 points. And then I just solve these 2 little pieces. Okay, so we say x plus 3. Well, when that equals 0, y would equal 0. And when x plus 2 equals 0, y would also equal 0. Right? Because when this equals 0 here, 0 times whatever is here would be 0. And if this is 0, 0 times whatever is here would be 0. So we solve these, and we know my solution is that x equals -3, x equals -2. So my answers to this equation here would be x equals -3 and -2. Those happen to be 2 points. It's -3, 0 and -2, 0. Okay, that part you don't need to know, this part. Okay, but I do need you to be able to take a quadratic, factor it, okay? And for this week, we're going to factor them for you. So all I'm going to have you do is solving. So I'm going to be giving you from here down. So for this week, all I need you to really understand is how to go from here to here, and you're done. Okay, but I do want you to understand why we're doing this is because we want to find these 2 dots right here. All right, and we know y is equal to those, so we set them equal to 0, and that's why we're doing all this stuff. Okay, and next week what we're going to do is we're going to factor stuff into this and then solve it. Okay, which will be practice from like the stuff that you just came off of. All right, so maybe watch that again and then try some of the IXL problems in the video to follow. Okay, hope that helps.